We're entering the 1850s addition to the house. My grandparents used these rooms as bedrooms and a sitting room. The only knowledge that we have of the way this was furnished is from this photograph of my grandmother, taken probably in 1914, standing right where I am at the side of the fireplace. The fireplace has Tsuki tiles inset into it, which were probably put in that year or the year before. The reason that we don't know what the furnishings were like is that the door that we entered through was added in 1940 in order to turn these two rooms into an apartment so that there'd be someone on the property year-round. At that time, we lost track of what the furnishings were. So it gives us a chance now to use this area as the Couse Foundation office and to kind of have an introductory place to our tour so that we can tell about the family history and about different ways that Couse worked and so forth, sort of an introduction to the tour of the studio and the house. This is the main entrance into the house. It comes into one of the oldest rooms in the building. It was used by my grandparents as an entrance to the studio. Never was a comfortable living room. They used to show their collections, which you see still in this room, and they also had paintings that were current at that time, his Indian paintings, that people could buy. But we don't have that many of those paintings left, so we put some of his earlier paintings from the French period on the wall. That way people can see those, which they don't usually get a chance to see.
I'm entering through the oldest doorway in the house. Originally it opened into the corral until this extra wing was added. It's an interesting old door space. You see the erosion that's taken place in the door sill over time. And over here on the door jamb we have a little cross carved into the surface. We understand that's to keep the witches out. The floor is the original floor that Couse put in, but it was later sanded and varnished. The ceiling, however, is very important because it's the only really original ceiling to the early Spanish period, and it's made of hand-split, hand-planed boards. They're short. They go from one viga to the next. The Couses designed these three benches to be fitted into their specific spots, and the seats are able to be lifted for storage underneath. The fireplaces of this design were installed by the man that owned the house in the 1850s. It's definitely an Anglo style, not of the early Spanish character. The Couses made very few changes to the fireplace over time. A little bit of rounding of the firebox, and they added in the nicho at the top.
One of the reasons that they created that nicho was probably to house the bulto or saint figure that's up there now of the Mary of the Immaculate Conception. It's made by Jose Rafael Aragon, who was a very famous santero at that time. All of the bultos and retablos, as the flat saint figures are called, date from the late 18th century, early 19th century. It's quite an important collection. My grandmother started collecting in 1902 when they first came to Taos.
The metalware was one of their particular interests, and they collected copper and brass and some pewter. We know that some of the pieces were acquired in France because we see them in pictures of their studio. Electricity came into Taos in 1928, and that would have been the time that they would have created these chandeliers.
My grandfather painted this picture the summer of 1890. They were living in Cernay-la-Ville, an art colony south of Paris. It was the summer after they were married. And the purpose was for him to paint his big salon picture that summer. He chose this subject of a man on his deathbed. Of course, in the salon, you wanted to show a painting that would touch the emotions of the viewer and also that would demonstrate your ability as technically. And he certainly did that with the way he captured the light from the candle, reflected light onto the sheets, onto the figures, and so forth. The woman in the background is his landlady. The younger woman in the foreground was the landlady's daughter. We don't know who the old man was, but we do know that he was truly in agony, because that summer they had an infestation of flies and he was being bitten. My grandmother told her sister in a letter that it was good for Couse, but it was not good for the poor old man. When they took the painting back to Paris at the end of the summer, Bouguereau, Couse's teacher, wanted to see his summer's work. But the painting was too big to take to Bouguereau's studio, so Bouguereau said, "I'll come to your studio and see it." That was all right, except it was a big problem since they had not told Bouguereau that they had married. And they knew that Bouguereau would not approve of that because he would have thought that it would interfere with Couse's career. But my grandmother wanted to hear what Bouguereau would say about the painting, so she hid behind a curtain in the studio. And when he came, he was extremely complimentary about the picture. He thought it was very fine work. And before he left, he sat down on the bed in their studio and said, patted it and said, "I see that you sleep in your studio. That's good," he said. "Save your money for your work." On the opposite wall is another picture painted that same summer. In Green Cabbage Woman, he painted his landlady once again. She had a wonderful vegetable garden and would bring him vegetables for his lunch every day. She had taken quite a liking to him, but she always insisted on cooking them first so that his American wife would not ruin them. Around the turn of the century, Granddad painted a great many pastorals. At that time, paintings of Indians were not popular with buyers, so this was his bread and butter. Many of them were painted in France, some up at the sheep ranch in Washington, and also a few here in Taos when he first came. The frame on this particular painting is a good example of one that Granddad made himself. He started doing that about 1928 when he no longer had his New York frame makers handy. He would buy moldings at the local lumber yard, put them together in various configurations, and do some simple carving on them.
When the Couses first came to Taos in 1902, they began to collect the local Spanish furniture as antiques, but they began also to enlarge their Native American collection, which included this beautiful San Juan dough bowl and the black Santa Clara jar. This chair is referred to as in the Peñasco style, named for the village south of Taos, where this sort of style was used, and it's characterized by that cutout shape in the back. This is a 6-board chest with dovetail corners, wrought iron hardware, including the hinges and latch, and on the front face is a vine design in red stain with 2 small lions of Castile. This pair of chairs is special in the collection because we think they're the oldest of the lot, and they have a very nice chip carving decoration on them.
Most of the Native American collection that he used in his paintings is in the studio. Couse's studio is the only one that still exists as it was in the early days of the art colony. It's like walking 100 years back in time. He painted here from 1909 until his death in 1936.
What Couse did was take the end wall and the roof off of this particular room, extension of the original house, and raise the roof in order to put in the very large studio window. This window is made in the typical fashion of the early artists here. Glass came in small boxes from the east, and the way that they put it together, there are grooves in the vertical members of the window, but no horizontal structure. That was to reduce the amount of shadow from those elements into the studio. The building had to be raised, so they took off the original roof and tilted the framing of the roof line down so that they had a ridge between the framed upper section and the adobe brick section below. That junction was made into a shelf on which they stored the pottery. Right on the corner is where the original building ended, and they extended both south and east in order to enlarge the studio. There are very few Indian paintings left in the family, but these are all original, and the little ones are plein air sketches. They'd often go out to the mountains or the river, or even on a trip to Arizona, and he would always do these little sketches. However, this particular picture is a Klickitat Indian painted up in the Northwest when he lived on his wife's family ranch. The fireplace over here is built in for the purpose of providing a motif for paintings. They weren't here in the wintertime until very late, and so it wasn't heat that was important, it was the structure of the fireplace in the paintings. Also back here we have the extra storage of frames that were not in use at the time.
This is the very spot where Granddad painted many of his pictures. On the easel you see an unfinished painting where he's blocked in the figure, started the underpainting. He could then pose his model on the platform and finish the painting. This is the taboret with his palette on top, 3 drawers of brushes and other equipment in the base, and this is the very chair that he sat in. In this painting titled Indian Artist, we have an artist painting an artist. My granddad was a great admirer of Indian arts and crafts, and he made a big collection of pottery from this area, like these beautiful San Juan pieces, and Sioux moccasins, other moccasins, but he would include them in his paintings. Here you see this pair of moccasins in the painting. It's interesting that people who come to the studio can find the exact pieces of pottery in their painting, if they happen to have a painting by Couse up on the shelf. He usually painted the pots quite accurately, but would sometimes change the size for the purpose of the composition. This painting of 2 young Indians beside the river looking into the distance where they're watching some birds is typical of many of Couse's compositions, where he painted the Indian from the back as if the viewer was actually participating in the scene.
Couse was famous for his moonlight and firelight paintings, and this is a typical moonlight scene. The figure is planting small painted sticks, often with feathers, next to a pool that is a sacred place. Particularly interesting, though, on this painting is the frame. Couse had about 4 basic designs for frames that he then had his frame makers in New York execute for him. The detailing is Indian in feeling, but it really is not an Indian design, which is interesting in the way Couse produced this particular motif. Here we have 6-board Spanish chest, dovetailed at the corners. Originally, there were moldings tacked on with horseshoe nails, but many of those parts have come away. It's interesting in that it may have not been by a Spanish carpenter, but by a Native American. And the reason that that is thought is the bright coloring and the execution of the figures that a Spanish chest would often have. What look like puppy dogs here are the lions of Castile, and the bird figures, which should be eagles, look more like chickens.
The paintings behind me are prints of his paintings made by various companies, including the 6 small ones which were from the Santa Fe Railway calendar. This is a collection of Tsuki rain gods which were made for the tourist trade. My grandmother started collecting them in 1902, which turned out to be the hottest summer ever recorded in Taos. She was glad to have any encouragement for the rain.
The Hopi pottery is a piece collected from Walpi during a stay that the Couses made in 1903. They traveled to Hopi, and Couse painted, and Mrs. Couse and their son Kibbe would sit and watch Nampeo make the pottery. Nampeo was one of the famous potters of the early 20th century who revived a pottery style at Hopi that had been popular in the late prehistoric. The other vessel to the left is a Zuni piece representing clouds and rain.
This is one of the paint boxes that Granddad used when he would go on location to paint plein air. This portrait of Granddad was painted by Simon Harmon Vetter, who was a friend of his, had studied with him at the Académie Julienne in Paris. It was painted in 1904, which would have been 2 years after Granddad came to Taos. I'm sure it was painted in New York City. There's Granddad seated in his chair at the easel.
One of the processes that Couse used in producing a painting was to photograph his models, often taking them into the countryside or here in the studio for a number of pose shots, which he then could grid the image and transfer the pose to the canvas. From that point, he would begin his color. We found 5,000 of the negatives and prints of his model studies in his darkroom here, and another 5,000 around the corner in a closet. There is nothing in his darkroom except a few shelves and a sink made from a kerosene can into which he dumped the chemicals. They went out through a pipe into the backyard ditch. And these had to be processed without the benefit of running water or electricity. We believe he did all his exposure by sunlight.
We're entering the Couse dining room now.
This is the oldest part of the house. It was a little one-room rustic house built by a man named Pedro Luna, perhaps a relative of Juan who had built the chapel. The beams are unpeeled. It probably had no windows. The doorway that we just came through was a partition that was put in the 1850s, but the date on the original building was 1839 based on dendrochronology or tree ring dating.
The ceiling boards, however, were replaced in the 1980s. The room is furnished as it was when my grandparents used it as their dining room. All of the paintings around the walls are by my granddad, with the exception of this portrait of him, which was painted by his friend Rittenhouse. On this wall, we have Couse's copy of a painting by Ribot, a French painter of the 19th century. It used to hang in the Louvre when he copied it as a student. It now hangs in the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. The subject is Saint Sebastian.
Saint Sebastian was a captain of the archers in the Roman army, and ultimately they discovered he was a Christian, and so he was condemned to death. He asked if his own men would be the ones to execute him. he survived the arrows, and in the painting, he is being ministered to by a lady who's tending to his wounds.
On the fireplace, they displayed some of their collection of brass, pewter, copper, other metals that they liked. We know that the bowl in the center was collected in Paris because it shows up in one of their Paris studio photographs. In the nicho is what's called in this area a bulto, a saint carved in the round by one of the local santeros in the late 19th century. I believe it's probably St. Francis. Some of the furniture in the dining room dates from the earlier period of their residency, like this mission-style table. Mission style was very popular with the artists at that time. My grandparents had these chairs copied from earlier Spanish-style chairs, Hispanic from this area. They had a local carpenter make them, and Mrs. Sharp liked them very much, so she had a set made for her house. But then she found them uncomfortable and sold them to Mrs. Blumenschein. The hutch over here is probably another early piece made by a local carpenter, and it houses my grandmother's collection of willow ware. The light fixture probably dates from soon after 1928, since Taos got electricity in 1928. It probably was never used with candles, but we don't know about that. The lampshade was made by Ralph Myers, who had come to Taos in the early part of the 1900s. He was what I think of as a Renaissance mountain man because he seemed to have talents to do everything. He was not only quite a good painter, although not a professional painter, but he did all kinds of crafts. He was a great friend of the Indians, and he made the lampshade out of rawhide. It sometimes starts crackling from the heat when we're having a dinner party, and when that happens, we always say that's Ralph talking to us. The two paintings to the right of the hutch are of my dad, Kibby, that Granddad painted when he was about 20 years old, and another when he was 5 or 6 years old. The large chest of drawers in the corner was probably given to them by a wealthy patron in New York. It's the nicest piece of furniture in the house.
This doorway leads to the area that the Couses used for their bedroom and sitting room, and today we use it as the foundation office.
The two paintings to the left of the doorway are by my granddad. The top one, a copy that he made of a Corot, and the lower one, a self-portrait that he did when he was about 16 before he went to study art in Chicago.
This is a tall 19th century case clock that they brought from their New York studio in 1928. The mechanism is Black Forest German, but the case is probably American made.
We grandchildren weren't allowed to open that door. They had some arrows stored in there, and they told us that they were poison arrows so that we wouldn't get into the clock.
And then the portrait here is the earliest painting that Couse did of his future wife. This is about the time they first met in Paris. And it's a beautiful portrait, unusual because she's facing you. Normally she posed in profile. The stove is a coal-burning stove. In 1928, when they came and spent their first winter here, they found it was much colder than they realized, so they injected stoves like this in the house. Over here, this double door was a replacement of a window that they put in 1913 in order to have the opening onto their garden when they had dinner parties here in this room. And it's particularly interesting because the needlework here was done by Ginny's grandmother. She did quite a lot of that, and we have a trunk full. The hinges, on the other hand, are rather special because they're so unusual. Couse said that they were made by an Indian blacksmith. Unfortunately, all we know is that they were put there in 1913. The latch, on the other hand, is interesting because it was made by the blacksmith that fixed the famous broken wheel of the broken wheel story. And we have in an account book the ordering of a latch and a pair of hinges. The hinges, we believe, are on the front gate where you came in earlier.
Here we have another painting that Granddad did in the Louvre as a student, copying one of the masterpieces. The painting is a deposition by Giuseppe Ribera, who was a 17th century Spanish painter. I think this copy by Couse is especially wonderful when you think that he was only 20 years old when he did it. These two pieces of furniture, a little bit fancier, were brought from their New York studio in 1928. This one in particular is nice. It has a marble top, and it did originally have etched glass doors. Probably those were damaged when they shipped it. Shipping to Taos was not exactly easy in those days because the railhead was quite far away. Here we have another portrait of my grandmother. It's interesting because it was probably cut from a larger picture. Here you see the paws of a kitty that was sitting on the table. Here we have Couse's portrait of his father, Moses, painted in 1896. Ernie, let's show them the kitchen. The kitchen was part of the old house, but in 1912, my grandmother wanted a bigger kitchen, so they enlarged it by moving the wall, the old wall, which was right here. You can see how thick the adobe used to be, and moving it to the west.
The extension allowed a thick wall that could then be utilized as a place to store food in the summer to keep it cool, in the winter to allow even a chicken to freeze out there. And the fun part about the windows are that they faced Mrs. Sharp's kitchen on the property next door. And so Mrs. Sharp and Mrs. Couse could communicate between their kitchen windows.
The window has glass on the inside, but screen on the outside. The furnishings in this room are from various periods, from 1909 to the present. These chairs go back to 1909, perhaps even before. But the table was purchased by my granddad in around 1930 from Long John Dunn. It's one of his gambling tables.
The original table probably had a green felt top, not the red wood. And there's a slot in the middle where the house had its take. Every hand, as I understand it, somebody would put money in the slot for the company, and then it would end up in a drawer down here. This hutch-like cabinet here with the marble top probably dates in the 20s, but the cupboard over on this side is from, I believe, the earliest creation of this little house, Pedro's house. It may well go back to that time, but in a different location.
And that's the high chair that Beth and Irv and I used as children. We're going into the west wing now that was added in the 1930s.
After this addition to the kitchen, the exterior offset of the chapel was made into a pots and pans cupboard.
After my grandmother passed away and my mother and father came to take care of Granddad, they needed more bedroom space, and that's when this wing was added. Originally, this had been the corral, and this area over here was the hay storage.
This part of the west wing has some very interesting features. This swinging door into the kitchen was made in the early 30s. There are a number of doors with the Kachina motif added onto the house at that time. Over here, the original library that would be from the time of the elder Couses, the artist and his wife. And then this very special item we have here, which was originally in their New York studio, and believe it or not, it was a daybed, and 2 people slept on it. When Kivy added on the west wing, he had linen cupboards built in here and made the hinges, which are beautiful, and he could do that because he was an expert welder.
In addition, he built a very special thing, a hidden playhouse for my sister Elizabeth, who was 5 years old at the time. This was not only my sister's secret playhouse, but also her bedroom. Here is a portrait of our little dog Hinky Dink, painted by a well-known Taos artist, Isla McAfee. On these shelves are some of our original toys. Many of them actually work. For instance, here's a little sewing machine that we could crank to make it sew, a little electric iron that actually ironed, and an electric stove. We used to cook little tiny potatoes on that. One of my favorite toys, however, was this mill, which has its little things that go with it, a little corral with a sheepdog, little wagon with the donkey pulling it. I used to like to play with that one. The photograph is of Granddad with his 2 granddaughters, my sister Elizabeth, and me sitting on her lap. The fireplace actually works, although I don't remember it ever being used when I was little. The little door to the outside is one of the wonderful decorative doors, probably designed by my mother. As you can see, it has my sister's initials carved into it, Elizabeth Ann Couse. On this shelf is a photograph of my granddad shortly before he died, with me as a 4-year-old and my brother as the baby. There are a few more things I'd like to show you. The chest of drawers was brought from New York when my grandparents moved everything here from their New York studio. One of the best features of this room is this beautiful Pueblo Revival fireplace that was built into the corner. They inserted a wonderful early Hopi plate into the fireplace. On the other wall is a little vent that has a wonderful little carved door on it. We've been doing all that we can to preserve this unique site, and we appreciate your help and your participation.
Historic preservation is extremely important to not only the town, but to the state and to the country. We thank you for visiting the Couse-Sharp Historic Site.